David. Today we're going to look at doing a short service on the KTM Duke. By a short service, what I mean is the one that you do every 7,500 kilometers, that's just a bit under 5,000 miles, or annually, so once a year, whichever the first two happens. In my case, I don't ride this bike 5,000 miles a year. However, it still needs servicing, so I service this yearly. That's the main service. Now in between I will do other things like my normal daily checks, and I will change the oil more frequently, but this is the annual service. If you do more miles, then you'll do pretty much the same thing at 7,500 kilometers. There's a couple of little bits that are different, but what I've done is I've merged both services into one because there's really very little difference. Much of what you will see here in this service is what I've already talked about in my daily checks. So if you do your daily checks or weekly checks on that regular basis on your bike, you'll already be doing most of what's covered in the service. There's two things that we're probably not going to be covering. The first is reading fault codes. If you don't have a code reader, you can simply drop the bike into your KTM dealer and get them to read the codes for you. If you live somewhere where you can't get to a KTM dealer, then you can buy the kit you need yourself. There's some apps you can put on your phone, and you can get the appropriate cables that connect to the bike to your phone to read and reset the codes. The other thing I'm not going to cover is setting the headlamp height, simply because I haven't got enough room in here to actually do it, because you actually need a 5 meter space. So I will probably do that as a separate video, which I will then link into this one. So let's get into it. Now the first thing you're going to notice is that I've got this up on a stand which has got both of the wheels off the ground. This isn't necessary, but you will need some sort of stand to keep the bike upright at certain points during what we're doing. There's different ways of doing it, different sorts of stands you can use, and certainly if you've got help from a friend, if you need to hold the bike upright, you can do all of this with improvised stands, whatever you've got to do it. Just be careful to make sure that you are safe when doing it and the bike doesn't fall and break itself or you in the process. Starting point is to check all the electrics, and again this is something that's in your daily checks. Now with the engine off, only the position light comes on. If I was outside in the daylight, when I start the engine, then the DRL will come on. That's the middle one of the three. If I put it onto main beam, then the bottom one here, so that's main beam or high beam. But we also want to check that the low beam is on. We can test the low beam by covering up the sensor that's here. So if we covered this up here, we would see this going from daylight. You can see at the moment it's in night mode because it thinks it's quite dark in the shed. If we were to cover this up here, this will go from the DRL to low beam. And of course we do the same test with the rest of the electrics. So for example, we check indicators, front and rear, and we can see that the rear light is on, but we test the brake lights with both switches and that's all good. So as far as we're concerned, there's only one more thing we need to test. So that's pretty much it for the electrics. We've already tested the starter, so we know that works, and there really isn't very much else to test. The only thing we could test would be the cutout switches, for example on the clutch and the side stand. With the electricals tested, next thing to do is to change the oil. Now I've got a separate video on changing the oil, so refer to that if you're not sure how to do it. So you need to change the oil, the filter, and to clean the two screens that are underneath the bottom of the engine. Next, we change the air filter. In order to change the air filter, you've got to remove the airbox lid. This is not a stock airbox lid, but it's effectively the same. This is an open airbox lid, which is supposed to give you slight performance gains. So we just remove the 6 screws. So air filter is just this green filter here. Now to remove the air filter, there are 2 tabs here that you press forward, and keeping them pressed forward you can then lift this out. You won't have this cable in the way, so we simply take this out, and as you can see in here, this one's pretty dirty. Now I must admit, I forgot to buy a new air filter, and with that given a good clean and cleaned out inside here, then this can go back in. Now I wouldn't recommend putting this one back in, but I need to buy myself another one, so that just sits down into there. A little bit of wiggling, push the clips out of the way, get it seated, and make sure the clips sit in there. Make sure the airbox lid sits tightly down in there, and reinstall. With the filters changed, let's move on to the back wheel. Now much of this will be familiar from the daily checks, but it's a little more in detail. So let's start with the brake disc. I want to make sure that there's no excessive wear on this, and if you can't feel a ridge, then you're certainly well within wear limits. Otherwise you've got to measure the width of the disc. We also want to check the pads to make sure they've got at least 1 mil of wear on them, or 1.5 mil is probably safer. So if we get a torch, we can look here, and I can look down the other side. It's a little bit difficult to see, but you can actually see the actual pads, and the disc should move smoothly without the pads binding. While we're looking at the brakes, we want to check the fluid level. You can see whether or not you're at the minimum level. So we want to check all the hoses that lead to and from the brakes. So what we have here is we have the reservoir here. There's a hose runs down and goes into the master cylinder here, and then there's a hose leads from here. Now it actually disappears off because it goes up to the ABS pump and then comes back down. But what I'll do is just check all of these hoses down here and the ABS cable are not damaged in any way, and just check them all the way back to the brake. You will find sometimes that the ABS cable here can get bulged out and it can rub on the tyre, so be very careful that isn't happening with yours. You might want to put an extra cable clip on there, or just move the clips around so that that stays well away from the tyre. Whilst we're at the back tyre, we want to check the tyre itself, make sure that there's no damage to it, there's no stone stuck into it, and that the wear bars are well below the surface, so that we've got good amount of tread left on it. You will find some stones embedded, so always worth just hooking those out before they work their way down through the tyre and create a puncture. Finishing with the rear wheel, let's look at the suspension. So what we're looking at here is to check that there's no leaks from the shock, no damage that we can see. What we need to do now is to check that there's no issues up in the bearing here. So we want to get hold of the swinging arm, just see if we can move it both sideways and in twisting motion. Okay, can't feel anything, but I wouldn't expect to because this is a low mileage bike, so that's all good. Having checked the rear swinging arm, what we also need to do is to check the bearings in the rear wheel itself. So grab it top and bottom and just try and wiggle it side to side. If you can feel any play, you need to check the rear wheel bearings. Move around the other side of the bike, we want to check the chain and sprockets. Now you also need to get this washer that sits behind there. What we're looking for is that there's no wear on the teeth, so they're not hooking at all. So we're looking the same on the rear sprocket, so check carefully that there's no damage to the teeth here, they're not wearing. They'll wear on one side and sort of look like they're hooking, so we're checking that. We also check the chain and check the tension. Got a separate video on checking the chain and tension, so I'll link you into that one. When putting this back on, this piece of plastic here that sticks out has got to go underneath this here. If you don't do that, it won't go back on. If you do it, then it goes back in really easily. And don't forget your spacer that goes behind here before you try and put this bolt back in. And that completes the checks on the rear end of the bike. Don't forget to check the tyre pressure when you're checking the tyre. Moving on to the front wheel, we've got pretty much the same things to check. So we check the pads to make sure there is enough pad left on them. We check the brake hoses. Obviously they're going to go all the way up to the handlebar to make sure there's no damage, and the ABS as well. And when we've followed the lines back up to here to make sure they're not damaged, they're not pinched, they're not kinked anywhere, then we're going to check the fluid level is correct in the reservoir. We're going to check the brake disc to make sure it's within the wear limits, and we're going to check the front tyre just as we did the back for wear, for damage, for stones, and we're going to check the tyre pressure. Just as we did with the rear shock, we're also going to check that there's no leaking here on the fork legs. You need to do this on both fork legs. Obviously clean this first. It's ideal if you clean it, if you then bounce it up and down, you'll then see if there's any oil here, but this should be nice and dry. Also check for rust pits and anything else, and check on both. Now what we also need to do is to pull down the dust seal on here. Now, it can be a bit stiff, and it should be a bit stiff. Ideally, if you've got a plastic tool, sort of like a car trim remover, something like that, you can just ease it down. Just take your time and do not gouge at the dust seal. These do build up dirt and stuff behind them. There we go. And what we need to do is to give this a good clean out and up inside here to remove all the dust and stuff that otherwise can actually work its way up into the oil seal. Once you're happy you've got it cleaned up inside there, KTM recommend you spray a little bit of what they call universal oil up there. Of course, there's a Moto product that they recommend to do that. That just helps seal and keep it clean. I'm just going to use a bit of CRC. And then wipe off all the excess. Now when you put these back up, what I would recommend is, because there's not a lot of room, particularly on the other side where you've got the brakes and everything else, is that you try and get the back side in first, and then you can get this all the way up. And you want this nice and tight, because obviously it is a dust seal, so we don't want any gaps for stuff to get up in there. So do that for both sides. Just as we checked the rear wheel bearings, we also need to check the bearings in the front wheel. Now I find it easier if you put the wheel against the actual stop, because otherwise it does tend to wobble about quite a lot. And just see if you can feel any movement. It takes a bit of practice to get this. Try it a couple of different places. This feels okay. So we checked the wheel bearings. What we now need to do is to check the headstock bearings themselves, the triple trees, fork clamps, whatever you want to call them. Now there's two things we need to do. The first is we want to check side to side movement. Now there's quite a lot of resistance on these because there's lots of cables and stuff, so it likes to sort of bounce back to the middle as a result. But what we're looking is we're sort of feeling it should be buttery smooth as it goes from one side to the other. If it feels a little bit notchy, then you've got wear in the headstock bearings and they will need to be replaced. The other thing we want to do is just to grab down the bottom of the forks, and like we did with the wheel bearings, is just push it backwards and forwards and see if we can feel any play. If there's any play, then you might need to tighten up the actual headstock bearings themselves. But you don't want the headstock bearings too tight, because if they're too tight, then the forks, you can't turn the forks. They won't actually lean into corners for you when you are counter steering and stuff. So it wants to be about right, and that's really hard to describe, but this is about right. There's no real resistance. I can just feel the cables and it is buttery smooth. While we're here, what we want to do is to check the coolant level. Now what you will find is that you can't see this, but if we take a torch and we put it behind, then we can now see through it. Now what this is showing is that my coolant level is too low, but you've got to bear in mind I've got this up on a stand and the front of the bike is currently a bit higher than the back, so you would need to repeat this test with both wheels on the ground. And that is most of the work done on the service. Now there's a couple more bits that we need to do. You need to take the bike for a test ride. After test ride, what you're supposed to do is check the fault codes again. So that's something that you might need to work with your KTM dealer on. It won't cost you a lot of money for them to actually do that because you've done the bulk of the work yourself on the service. What you also need to do is to work around the bike and to grease moving parts. By moving parts, I mean things like the brake lever, the clutch lever, the kickstand, and this sort of thing, so that anything that moves actually is probably lubricated and isn't running dry. And that might include your rear foot pegs and that sort of stuff. So have a work round. The next thing you need to do is to work your way methodically around the bike and to check all the bolts are properly tightened. Now, I found when I did this that actually my kickstand bolt was actually a bit loose, which I hadn't noticed. Just work your way around methodically around the bike and to check everything is tight. Now, if you were to do this properly, you'd do all the torque. So you'd unbolt, undo everything, re-torque it up, clean off Loctite, put new Loctite on, and so forth, if you're doing it properly. And that's quite a big job. So you can make your own level of decision how much you want to go on that, but at least work your way around the bike and check all the fastenings to make sure that, like me, you don't find that something is loose and then falls off while you're riding. And the last thing you want to do, once you've done all of that and you've finished your service, is to reset your service interval. And there's a separate video on doing that too, because it's quite an easy process. So good luck with servicing your bike. It will keep it running smoothly for much longer and give you less problems, and you'll become much more familiar with your bike and spot things going wrong with it earlier. So thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again soon.